Hey folks, Steve here with a 1918-1919 Storm in the West video. In this video, I'm going to just take some time and talk freely as sort of a post-mortem to the last couple of series of videos I just did covering 1918-1919 Storm in the West. And I will say that World War I strategic game is not really accurate. This is certainly an operational game to my mind. And of course, in the past of my gaming experience, I'm used to strategic level games. So this is just another instance of me playing a operational game, maybe not always playing well, but it was an interesting set of plays here, right? And I'll go ahead and say up front that if you were watching the last video carefully, the Allied offensive turn 12 through 16. There are some moves I probably could have made as the Germans on the last turn that might have saved them from victory. So at the end of the day, if you want to sit back and say, well, the Germans probably should have won, I could understand that. I mean, the nice thing is, the game felt tight towards the end. Every action really mattered. And I guess that kind of gets into my thoughts. So we had the first play where I set up the Germans really thinned out, and we played from turn 1. And that was a disaster, right? I got to like turn 2 or 3. It wasn't working. I didn't set up well. And so that was not worth the continuing. But then we started over again, and we had all of our Stoßtruppen up here, and we played through, and we won by turn 7 with major offensive action focused on the British, and that seemed to work very well. And then finally, obviously, we had this playthrough of the Allied offensive where technically the Allies won, but it really could have easily gone the other way. But it was a tight run thing the whole time, and it was an interesting playthrough. Now, my general thoughts as I look back on it is like, yeah, I probably didn't play very well all the time. There were probably a couple of times where I violated the U.S. stacking limit where you can have up to 9 U.S. divisions stacked with non-U.S. units. I am sure I probably snuck ahead of that 9 at some point, at various points throughout this Allied offensive playthrough. I don't think it probably impacted the game too much, but something to keep in mind, I guess. So, I don't know. Anyway, any which way you want to look at it, just sort of something to keep in mind. But still, what's interesting as I examine the game is that, each turn really matters. 16 turns is not very many. And this isn't a World War II game where, you're going to bust a line and then have this huge encirclement. That's not going to happen. And in fact, a lot of the time, you can kind of bust a line, but the opponent, the defender, whomever it is at that given point in time, has a decent chance of covering up the hole somehow. And I'm sure that I misplayed some of the Allied tank support and their units that are able to infiltrate, and I probably could have done a better job with that. But there's definitely some challenges as the Allies. So, maybe it would have made more sense to have the French tank and the British tank nearby each other, so that my advancement with the one set of units with the British tank could be further helped by the French doing the same thing in the same sector. Because what I found to be a real challenge as the Allies is that where the Germans have infiltration-capable units in spades, right? When they have the Stoßtruppen, they have a lot of them. They're always infiltrating, constantly infiltrating. The Allies basically have, at most, 4 stacks that can do infiltration. You've got the Australian-American Corps, which you need to kind of keep together to function well, but it can infiltrate. You have the French tanks, you've got a British tank unit, and then you have an American tank unit, and you don't get the American tank unit until deep into turn 12 or 13. And so you don't have a lot of infiltration capability, period, as the Allies. You really don't. And what I found difficult was okay, you're going to take your first loss. I've got my French tank unit here. First loss, okay, you lose it, right? You're going to lose it every time you use it. Because on the combat charts, there is no chart where you don't take a step loss as the attacker. So you're going to lose the tank every time. If you do that, the tanks are one-step unit. So they're always going to go away. So you got to after you're done as the allies, you're going to come to the next turn, you're going to build back the unit, but because unit's going to start at the map edge, unless you strategically move it, you're going to strat move it into a town somewhere, a city or town somewhere. But if it can't get to the front line in one movement, once you strat move it, and I like to cock them sideways, like you can't do mixed movement, right? I sort of screwed that up in my very first play. But once they've strat moved, they're not going to move for the rest of that turn. And so you rebuild the unit, it comes here, and you can't use it, right? Unless you manage to move it into a hex that's already on the front line. But as soon as you go beyond the front line, you can't get this guy involved. It takes 2 turns, basically, before that unit can come back again. So when you look at it that way, it's like that French tank unit, at best, may only get to really attack like 7 or 8 times across the entire game. And if you're talking about just the Allied offensive, they're really probably only attacking like 5 or 6 times, right? Or less than that, even, potentially. So, or 4 or 5 times, something like that, right? It's just you really don't get as much out of the tanks as you might think you do, because you're going to use them and then you're going to lose them for 2 turns, basically. So where you decide to use them is super important. Obviously, getting across the trenches is the best use of them. I mean, getting a +1 in any combat beyond the trench is not a big deal. But you could certainly use them. I mean, I think what I tried to do was like, I broke the line. I wanted to get the tanks up here, but that's not really a smart thing to do. What I should do, what you should do when you're playing the game, is you lose your tank marker, you bring it back, and then he comes over here, to help break a trench line, not further extend a penetration, right? Because what you want to do is you want to punch those holes in the trenches. That -2 to any attack while you're in a friendly trench hex, it's pretty gnarly, right, for the attacker. But if the tank can nullify that, what you're really doing is you're turning those, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 or 5 times you get to use that tank unit. What you want to be doing is using that to take a trench hex, so that you're taking 4 to 5 trench hexes. So I didn't really do that as much. I did that more, or it became more useful up here in the north, where when you rebuild the French, I'm sorry, not the French, the British tank unit, the British tank unit's going to pop up, let's say in Dunkirk. Then it can move 1, 2, 3, 4, it can get up here all in the same turn that you rebuild it. So the British tanks, you're going to get a lot more use out of. And so if you're looking at that as a way to say, okay, we're going to break up these trench hexes, that probably makes a lot more sense. Obviously, then you have to contend with the secondary line of German trench hexes, but I found those to not be nearly as bad, right? Because that -2 just such a killer, especially if there's other terrain or towns involved. I think the strategic movement stuff is really challenging. The fact that, like, if you strat move something, it's not going to move again, and to get on or off, a strat move, you have to be on a city. So the Germans kind of messed up because they didn't retreat back all the way back to these, Cambrai, St. Quentin, Lens. I guess they were on Lens for a while, but if you're not able to get a unit into these cities and you've gone beyond that, outside of your sort of like railhead network, then it's going to be really hard to strat move units where you need them, like back here, to garrison these important morale centers. And so that was a foul up on my part as the Germans and the Allied offensive set of videos. And it's certainly a challenge. Like, it's not like just because of its operational nature, like, you really have to look at these cities and towns and figure out how you're going to get units to where they need to be. And I even found that, like, most units don't have a lot of movement points. So, I mean, even on dry turns, right? This last time we played through, we didn't have any wet turns at all. So this all was, it was all pretty clear through here. But those rivers become a huge pain in the butt on wet turns because that's an extra movement point. And most units only have 3 to 4, maybe 5 movement points, period. So you're not even. I mean, it's even when we had a breakout, it was nice that the Americans had 5 movement points. They could actually get down this far, but it could have easily been a wet turn, and then hopping over these rivers would have cost too many movement points. So there's no unit out there besides the tank units, and even then, their movement is to get them to the front because they can't really attack by themselves. Most of the time, even if you've made a breakthrough, even if you're moving units, you're not moving a lot. You're moving basically just in a small little pocket of the map. You're moving up a little bit if you've got a wide open range. The Zocs obviously slow you down. Getting rid of units with Zocs or infiltration movement is a whole part of the game. So that is, I think, the real challenge area is getting, if you're going to break the line, wherever it is you're doing it, whether it's the Germans attacking wherever they are or the Allies attacking back, having that clear idea of where you're going to go, how you're going to negate the defensive terrain, and pack enough combat factors that your attacks are going to be worthwhile. Now, that makes me think of a whole other issue, not issue, but just a thing you have to think about in the game. I've never seen someone say, and I saw this on like Board Game Geek on the forums, somebody asked the question like, how can I lower my combat odds? Because I want my combat odds to be lower. You don't really hear that a lot in games. But this being World War I and being the way that it is, it totally makes sense, right? You just throwing a bunch of men into the battlefield doesn't mean they're going to actually do anything. It's not like, you can't throw men at the problem and expect to win. The combat charts, even if you're like, 7-1 odds is great in a World War II context. 7-1 odds in this game doesn't actually do you that much. I mean, in some ways it does. And what I think is really interesting, and this is a compliment to the game, is that your odds chart and where you want to be on that odds chart really depends on what you want to do, and I think that's really interesting. So, for instance, if you look at the 2-to-1 chart, and I'll show you on the array chart that I have here. If you look here, if you look at 2-to-1, if you can get a +1, then you're probably going to be in this range of like you're causing equal losses to your opponent and you're going to get some yourself. Even 3-to-1 is a little bit like that. 1-to-1, if you can avoid a 1 or a 2, let's say you got enough bonuses to get you above that, 1-to-1 is actually not so bad, right? If you're doing equal damage to your opponent, that's not so bad. You might do that, the lower odds attacks, if you're trying to drain the Germans, for instance, right? You say, I think we can, if you think you have the advantage of manpower, fight the little battles, right? Fight the little battles and wear your opponent down bit by bit by bit, and you're not losing, 4 guys for them only losing 2. You might be able to get them to lose 2, and you only take 2, right? Rolling a 3 on the 2-to-1 it might be in some ways better than 7-to-1, right? So if we look at like 7-to-1, if you rolled a 3, okay, you can take you hit them for 1, you take 2. You might be able to deal with that. But if you're only trying to eliminate 1 step of a unit or a 2-step unit, you might not need a 3, depending on your circumstances, if you've got them surrounded or Zoc locked or something. So like even looking at this, like, okay, yeah, maybe I want to get 7-to-1 odds, but if you can get 3 losses on the defender, and you want to guarantee that or have a high probability of that, you're going to want to go to these really high odds. 3 is usually enough to, for sure, eliminate a 2-step unit, a single 2-step unit in a hex. So all along this line here, where there's 1 unit, sure, if you can figure out a way to get 7-to-1 odds, you're going to guarantee that you eliminate that unit. Now, do you actually have enough extra units yourself to absorb that loss? That's the tough thing, right? But if it's worth knocking a trench hex away, maybe that's worth it, right? And I like, while I could say I probably didn't always play very smart in that analysis, thinking through that, how you're going to penetrate that trench line, if that's where you're at, is really interesting, right? If it's worth taking that trench hex, you got to play that risk management game, right? Risk analysis. Can I give up 4 steps of my guys to take that hex and think I can hold it? If so, yeah, the high odds attack might be worth it. Let's cause a lot of blood. If I'm just trying to pinprick my way, maybe I'm past the trench hexes, and I want to whittle these guys away so I can start surging in the backfield, maybe I do focus on those 2-to-1, 3-to-1 shorter odds. Even if I think I can get higher odds, I do the lower odds anyway, just to pinprick, not to be, you don't want to be overzealous in your attack, right? I think that's really interesting. And it's going to make, I think, you and your opponent, if you're playing this, really look at that CRT chart super closely, more closely than other games. Because if you're just playing like a World War II game or something with a more linear and straightforward, more is better CRT, yeah, you're obviously always going to try to get 6-to-1 odds. Here, there really is a choice to make. You really got to think through what kind of attack am I going to launch, even if I have the men to launch a huge attack. Does that help me? And in fact, I made some mistakes even in like the last video where it was I'm attacking a single step hex, and I threw too many guys in, and it was like, oh, I did 3 step losses to the defender, where there was only 1. If I had reduced it and tried to get 2 losses, that would have guaranteed that the unit couldn't retreat and it would be destroyed, and I would have maybe only lost 2 steps or 3 steps instead of 4 steps as the attacker. So you have to start getting into that. Obviously, I've got some lessons learned from playing this now enough that I feel much smarter about the game, even though this is my first couple of plays just learning the game itself. I've drawn a lot of interesting conclusions from it. So all that's very interesting. And obviously the Germans get a lot of advantages early on. Their AGB unit helps a lot. The Stoßtruppen help a lot. Whether or not I would always be able to replicate my German offensive into the Channel Port area, I don't know. It's like, is that the foolproof strategy? I don't know. I can't say for sure what I could have done better there. I could definitely say what I could have done better as the Germans in the Allied offensive scenario, but it does feel like the Allies are a little more disadvantaged on the offensive just compared to the Germans. But their intent is a totally different thing, right? The Germans are trying to overwhelm in a short amount of time, take either the French or the British, and overwhelm them individually, whereas the Allies are just trying to drain the Germans to the point where they can't defend everywhere, and they're bled dry, I think is the way to look at it. The Germans start the campaign game with 24 replacement steps representing the reinforcements from the Eastern Front, and they can, they feel pretty good with that, right? I mean, if you're willing to burn up those replacement points in the major offensives, but if that game I played where the Germans won, if I had maybe not gotten everywhere I needed to, I had spent out all of my replacement points, I would have been bone dry, and the Allies would have kept coming, and eventually we probably would have seen the German line further collapse, and maybe the Allies would have won, right? So in the early game, you're playing the campaign game, sure, the bet is the Germans, you're going to throw everything into some major offensive, you're going to try to do it better than historical and win outright. Failing that, if you've been too spendy with your manpower, you might not be able to survive to turn 16. So that's interesting. We didn't get to experience that because I won early and then we started with a later scenario, but I could definitely see that start to develop. What I find really interesting is, and this is a question about like the game system, or not the game system, just the game as history. I'm going to just move these guys for a second. If you look at, I guess I'll zoom out a little bit so you can see it down here as well, because it's sort of the same sort of thing. The historical Kaiserschlacht took, at least how it's marked on the map, these handful of hexes, this line, this sort of triangle of hexes here, and then this little square of hexes here, right? And the historical, I guess, like accusation is that the Germans didn't like have a really core, well understood strategic objective, and you can see that here, right? Like, I mean, okay, they were maybe trying to get to Bellhune and Hazebrook, didn't get very far. Down here, maybe they were trying to get to Arras, maybe they were trying to get to Amiens. They didn't get there. They took Soissons, and Chateau Thierry, pardon my French pronunciation, I'm sorry, maybe they were, they could have kept going and gotten to Paris, but it didn't happen. But it's interesting that the game, at least the way that the morale points are structured, that I have this huge incentive to just ignore these other areas and not, why try to take this area? There's no point. Go for here. That makes a whole lot more sense. Or, focus on, down here and taking these forts and then going that way towards Paris. That seems to make a lot more sense. So I guess there's a question there of, does the game provide any reason or incentive for you to do the historical thing? I guess the answer is no. Of course, the historical thing was very poorly chosen, I guess. So it does kind of make you wonder, like, what was going through their mind historically, when Ludendorff, decided on the plan, like, why would you go there? But maybe that belies the fact that, maybe they thought they were going to get a greater breakthrough. And, they did, I guess, because they were going to cut through here and then sort of split off north and break out this way. But they didn't quite get as far as they wanted to, I guess. So maybe it's not for want of trying. They tried a really wide cut, and it didn't work, I guess is one way to look at it. Just because there's not victory points right here doesn't mean what they tried maybe wasn't a good plan. But we have the hindsight of being in the future and being able to fiddle with the game pieces and the rule system the way we want to try things out. So I don't know. You will probably not see a turn 1 to 9 go very historically, because you're not going to make these same choices. I think you're going to go ahistorical every time, because the game system incentivizes you to do that. And as the Germans, you're going to try to do the channel port strategy. You're going to try to go maybe for a center to Paris strategy, or a, down here, some combination of these together or something like that, right? Like that seems to be the different options. And then you could decide to do a limited, a very conservative strategy, which I did not pursue. I was fairly bloody with the Germans. You could, just take Soissons, Chateau Thierry, or Reims, R-E-I-M-S, Reims, or Verdun. Pick a couple of places where you figure you're going to get your morale check passed, and then be super defensive. And if you've saved enough replacement points, you're going to be in much better shape to withstand the Allied offensives in the late game, right? So I think the game has a lot of decision space, which is a good thing. I wasn't sure how much decision space would actually exist, but I think there's plenty, and it's worth a replay. Now, I'm not sure I'm going to play this on camera for a while again, or maybe if I do, I'm going to do the 1919 scenario and try that out. That might be fun with the variant counters. But I do feel like there's a lot of, where you decide to go is going to feel different. The terrain is different over here. The terrain is different over here, right? You have more forests, and there's plenty of rivers. Over here, there's rivers, also a lot of rough terrain and mountains. Up there's the marsh, floodplains, and all that. Any way you go, the fights are going to feel a little bit different, I suspect. Examining the terrain, where you can go next. If you manage to get a breakthrough, what does that really look like? And how far can you go? I think all of that does make some sense to me. What was interesting in the Allied offensive campaign is that as the Germans were in here, the devastated terrain actually helps a lot. So it was like I didn't have as much reason to retreat. Like I started to pull back in some areas, but it wasn't a big a deal to stay in this devastated terrain because it helped defensively. It was like a secondary trench line almost beyond the Allied trench line. And so, it may be fool's gold because I should have been pulling units back to the towns for strategic movement, but I could hold some of these hexes back here well enough. So, I like any good operational game, analysis of the terrain, where's your path, where do you want to go, how do you want to tackle your offensive, has some interesting thought processes of where you think you're going to go. obviously I played this solitaire, so there's certain aspects of this I can't be sure how it would go against an opponent, right? I made mistakes that I could beat myself up for later when I saw, oh, I should have moved this here, I forgot, and now I'm leaving stuff open. Playing against a real opponent, that can happen, is sure to happen, actually, for sure. I mean, and unless you allow your opponent to fix it later, or maybe it's too late, right? They've said, yeah, my turn's done, and then you go and wallop them. That kind of stuff happens in opposed games all the time. So I'll spare myself too much self, beating up, because any mistakes that I make, I'm not going to spend 3 hours worried about every move I make, right? The faster I play, the looser I play, I just am able to have more fun because I'm not stressing about each move. But, there's plenty of opportunity to make mistakes, I guess, that your opponent will capitalize on. So there is that element of you do want to kind of look at what's going on. You want to see where they might have fouled up. You want to check the Zocs. Did they leave a lane of Zockless hexes that you can exploit somehow, maybe, as things get chaotic and lines are broken? What I do think is interesting is that you could certainly find a case in the game where, because both sides are attacking like crazy, that the board starts to empty out. We certainly were seeing that in some of our early turns, turns 1 through 9. If you spend out all your replacement points and you're really aggressive, units are going to be dying everywhere, and you're going to have empty spaces on the map that you can't even exploit because you don't have units nearby to exploit the gaps. Now, and I would interpret that in terms of simulation as, it doesn't mean there's nobody there. It just means all the units are so blown up, shot to hell, disorganized, and falling apart that in a military sense, I mean, there's no functioning army or corps or divisions or whatever in that area. It would just be total wasteland, chaos and no man's land, dead bodies everywhere kind of thing. Stragglers who are alive or not in a fighting mood kind of thing. That's how I would interpret it if you ended up with a map that was very empty from so much death and destruction. But again, it's Storming the West, it's Western Front, the final offensives, both, all the countries involved are exhausted, and this is sort of the final climactic set of battles, I guess, right? So, yeah, I feel pretty good with this one. I didn't have a huge amount of interactions with the fortresses other than the French trying to take German fortresses. I do think that the additional casualties are pretty gnarly. So for sure, you want to make sure you've brought a lot of force to attack that fort and that you can take all of the losses. And surrounding it definitely helps. Getting the extra bonuses from a concentric attack certainly help a lot. The air power, truly, there's not supposed to be a lot of air power in World War I game. What I found is that all that really happened for me as a solitaire game is the Germans could use theirs, and then the British would use theirs, and it would be negated, right? Or vice versa. So during the game where it's only the British Air Force and only the German Air Force, it was +1, -1. You could find a situation, I guess, where somebody decided to use theirs for a +1, and you held yours back because you were going to do it as a +1 later or a -1 later sort of thing. You can certainly do that. Me playing solitaire, it's hard for me to play the shell game, so I just did it that way. But then as the Allies got first the French Air Force and then the American Air Force, that is where it became, okay, arbitrarily in this turn, the Allies can get, 1 or 2 bonuses for air and throw that in and help out. And now that I'm thinking about the air power, I should probably validate how many air units you can actually use in combat. Because I think I did more than one. Da-da-da-da-da. Yeah, there's nothing saying that I can't do 2 in one battle. So, yeah, I guess I was fine using 2. So it would be, British and the Germans, okay, they negate each other, and then I would throw in the French and the Americans for a +2 somewhere on the board, usually some critical battle, and that worked out okay. The air power is not supposed to be a very huge thing in World War One, so it made sense that yeah, they could make the difference in a particular area, but not a huge amount, and really being used mostly to offset some sort of terrain bonus, right? So I'm attacking this important hex, but there's rough terrain. Okay, it's hard, if we think about simulation, it's hard to spot the enemy, where are they at, where are their positions. Well, here's the air support that's going to make the difference and allow us to attack that position more easily. It's really how I ended up using it. While you could use it on flat terrain and get a lot of bonuses, I didn't do that as much. So, 30 minutes long already, guys. Anything else to say as a postmortem? I don't know. I think that was it. A lot to talk about. The game plays fast. It was interesting. It was tense throughout as I played through. I did enjoy my time with it. I will do a proper review in time, probably sometime over the next week. But then we'll do that. We'll talk about the review and get into those details. But just these are my thoughts as I completed the game. Again, had fun. It was good stuff. A lot to consider here. A lot of decision points. Definitely worth some replays. There's different things you could try to do and try to tackle. And you don't know what your opponent's going to do when you get set up, so you kind of work your way through that. Yeah, this is pretty cool, and I'm really glad that the game came out. We tracked it from P500. It came out. We've played it now quite a bit. I got a good feel for it. So cool. Well, thanks for watching. If you wanted to stick around for this, realize another 30 minutes. What is it worth for you? But I think it's a valuable thing to watch and consider. What we experienced here. And I don't really have any criticisms of the game. Other than maybe Big Bertha should have been called something else. The counter doesn't reflect the right piece of equipment, I don't think, but that's not a big deal. Good stuff. All right. Catch you in the next one, guys. Take care. Keep on gaming.